Thanks, Rick. Yeah, as Rick said, I'm going to be sharing the results of some work that my co-authors and I have been involved with studying one of three subspecies of bar-tailed Godwit in the East Asia-Australasian flyway, and that's the Baueri subspecies of bar-tailed Godwit. And right off the bat, I'd like to thank the following groups for supporting this work. And honestly, this is not the only groups that have worked in this. This work is really the result of thousands of people over many, many years from dozens of organizations, and I just have the good fortune to present some of this work today. So this is probably familiar to a lot of you. This is the distribution of bar-tailed Godwit around the world. Bar-tailed Godwit is a long-distance, whole Arctic distributed shorebird. And within the East Asia-Australasia flyway, there are three subspecies, coarsely aligned from west to east by breeding and non-breeding range as the Minnsbri, Anadorensis, and Baueri subspecies. And the original population estimate for the species in the flyway did not differentiate among these three subspecies, which are not well described at the time, and the value of 330,000 birds was adopted in the mid-1990s. And subsequently, in recognition of reported population declines for the species in the flyway, the estimate was revised downward to 279,000 birds, with about 146,000 birds assigned to individuals in the Minnsbri population, 133,000 to the Baueri population, and the size of the Anadorensis population is really unknown, but it's believed to be quite small, around just 5,000 birds. And recently, the IUCN elevated the conservation status of the species as a whole from least concern to near threatened, and this was mostly in response to documented population declines within the East Asia-Australasian flyway populations. And in fact, were the three populations within this flyway to be assessed independently, they would all likely qualify as vulnerable based on either small or declining population sizes. So that's a brief overview of the conservation status of the flyway in the whole, and now I'll focus more on the topic of this presentation, the Baueri subspecies in particular. This is a population that breeds only in western and northern Alaska, and it spends the non-breeding season at sites in New Zealand and Eastern Australia, where about 2/3 of the birds are distributed in New Zealand and the remainder in Eastern Australia. During northward migration, the species migrates via the Yellow Sea, focusing especially at sites in Yalujiang en route to breeding sites in Alaska. Upon completion of breeding, the breeding adults and young of the year juveniles stage at sites in Western Alaska, especially near the mouth of the Kuskokwim River, before conducting nonstop about 9-day-long, 11,000 kilometer migration over the Pacific back to non-breeding sites. And the conservation status of the Baueri population is also elevated in the countries in which it primarily occurs. It's considered a species of greatest concern in the USA and considered endangered in Australia's most recent assessment and at risk and declining in New Zealand. This then forms the conservation backdrop for the subspecies. And really the inspiration for this talk is captured by the results of a couple of recent papers. The first paper, which was led by Jesse Conklin and published in EMU in 2016, nicely summarized a long, steady, well, it wasn't a nice decline, but a nice time series documenting a decline at counts in New Zealand. Let's see if I can. So it documented a decline until about population stability beginning about the year 2005. And concurrent with this decline in populations that counts in New Zealand was also a strong decline in adult survival up until the year 2012 that you can see here. The second paper is one that was authored by Colin Studds that came out in 2017 in Nature Communications that included count data from throughout the subspecies range, along with numerous other species, documenting declines from 1993 till 2012. This study documented a decline of about 1% per year for non-breeding counts from Eastern Australia, arriving at an overall population size in Australia of about 30,000 Baueri Godwits, and the counts from New Zealand declining from 1993 till 2012 constituted about a 1.5% decline per year with a population of 65,000 birds in 2012. And these two counts together generated a population estimate of about 110,000 birds, or an annual decrease of 1.4% per year from the time period 1993 to 2012. And this is considerably lower than the accepted population size of 133,000 birds. More recently, annual counts have continued in New Zealand, and there is more and more evidence that the population had continued to decline since 2012. This figure shows the results of biannual Godwit surveys, one conducted in the austral summer in November and December, these upper values here, the other conducted during the austral winter in June and July, these lower values here. These lower values represent non-breeding adults that don't migrate to Alaska to breed. So these are the overwintering population of subadults. In contrast, the summer counts represent all the birds in the population in Australia at the time the counts are conducted. And as you can see, since a high in about 2010, these counts have declined drastically up through 2018, arriving at an all-time low of 65,000 birds counted in 2018 during the summer count. So given these lines of evidence, declining counts and low adult survival, it was pretty clear that the population estimate of 133,000 birds was overly optimistic. And we suggested adopting a revised value derived from the work of Studs et al. Of 110,000 birds. And this is actually the value that you see in the abstract of our talk included in the conference proceedings. And this represented the state of the knowledge just about a year ago, the time when we were writing the abstract for this conference. And also at the same time, these continued declines spurred work on behalf of many people to better document the population sizes of the Bauer subspecies of Bar-tailed Godwit. For instance, we were motivated to conduct the first surveys since 1997 of migratory staging grounds in Alaska. Now, to the best of our knowledge, essentially all of the bar-tailed Godwits in Alaska stage at these sites, and they co-occur as one population that begins to stage in July, and which typically begins to depart in late August and September. And what we did is in 3 days in late August of 2019, we flew about 1,000 kilometers of coastline conducting aerial surveys, where we counted just over 100,000 Godwits. And given what we knew at the time, we thought that that was a pretty reasonable number, that when you take into account the number of subadult non-breeding birds still at their non-breeding sites in Eastern Australia and New Zealand, and combine this with the counts of birds counted in Alaska, this seemed like it meshed pretty well with our estimated population size of about 110,000 birds. And given that we had just managed to conduct a seemingly well-timed range-wide survey of migratory staging sites in Alaska, my co-author Rob Schuchard motivated and organized counts in Australia and New Zealand. This was not only an opportunity to really assess the relationship between counts conducted in Alaska at pre-migratory staging sites and those subsequently conducted soon thereafter in Australia and New Zealand, but these counts also represented really the first simultaneous surveys in both countries. And these counts were conducted by literally hundreds of observers across nearly 500 sites. They were conducted in February of 2020 in New Zealand and through January and March of 2020 in Australia. So these were very recent surveys. And when you tally the numbers from these counts and add in the values for the sites in Queensland that could not be surveyed, but which in the past had supported about 10,000 birds, you get a nice round number of about 126,000 baueri Godwits counted across the subspecies non-breeding range, considerably higher than the 110,000 that is in the abstract of the conference proceedings. So based on the best available evidence of just a year ago, it looked like a value of 110,000 was a solid revised population estimate for the subspecies. And it's nice to now be able to say that the most recent estimate is about 15,000 birds higher than that value. So where are we now? Over the course of this exercise, we identified many curious things. This is a figure I showed you earlier in the presentation, demonstrating the recent decline, the recent decrease in Godwit populations at counts from New Zealand between the 2010 and 2018. And this then continues that plot, but it adds in the most recent counts. And you can see that the most recent value for the summer count conducted in December of 2019 was 74,456 birds. This was about 10,000 more birds than the previous count from December of 2018. And you can also see that the subsequent winter count from this past July was nearly 13,000 birds, a jump of about 7,000 birds compared to the July 2019 count. So the large jump in the July count suggests that the large increase in the December 2019 count wasn't due to some odd counting errors or strange unexpected resettlement pattern of birds, but it was in fact likely the result of an excellent reproductive effort that year, the reproductive year of 2019, as reflected by the large increase in the counts from July 2020. So remember that these are all the non-breeding subadults, and so that this count went up so much suggests that 2019 produced a large influx of juveniles that joined the population. We also noted some funny trends in the results of the second winter counts from February of 2020. You can see that December of 2019, we counted 74,000, but just a few months later, counted nearly 7,000 more birds. This is not totally unusual, that oftentimes people have conducted multiple counts within one breeding season in New Zealand, and they've noted this. And while it's slightly confusing that suddenly 3 months later, 7,000 more birds would show up, we think this is likely just due to a slow resettlement during the migration process. But really, it's an open question that warrants more study. So to wrap this up, based on the most recent counts conducted across sites in Australia and New Zealand, our best estimate of the current population size of the Bauer subspecies of Bar-tailed Godwit is 126,000 birds. But long-term counts from non-breeding sites do indicate a general decline across the range. And also these long-term counts suggest a highly variable reproductive output that warrants further investigation. Which raises some interesting knowledge gaps and next steps for researchers. From Alaska, we still basically have no information on the reproductive output of the species to really question whether or not they have a boom-bust breeding cycle. Efforts to monitor nests would be wonderful. We've tried this in the past, and due to their very low density and cryptic nesting habits, it's essentially impossible to find enough nests to derive any sort of meaningful information. However, we have conducted extensive age ratio efforts wherein we observe pre-migratory staging flocks and look at the proportion of juveniles in those flocks, and that serves as a nice proxy of reproductive output. Age ratios come with their own set of problems, but it would be a nice start to really begin to assess what the reproductive output of the species is in Alaska. And with all this information, if you had counts from Alaska, Australia, and New Zealand, and you got some measure of breeding success, and you were banding birds such that you could understand recruitment patterns, and you coupled these with range-wide resites throughout the range from not just non-breeding sites, but also at sites in the Yellow Sea and in Alaska, you can start to partition survival across seasons, and you can understand the class structure of the ages within this population, really better understanding the demographic bottlenecks that might be affecting the species and gain insights into their demography. And this is sort of a gratuitous plug, but it always helps to track more birds. It's sort of phenomenal how much we learn when we stick a few tags on these birds. And this year, Jesse Conklin led efforts to track more birds and this is the first tracking of the subspecies in about a decade. And really interesting thing, I urge you to go to the global flyway network.org and look at these tracks and see what these amazing birds did. And really it helps us understand much better the demographic trends that we're seeing, the way that these birds resettle and distribute themselves and really do amazing unexpected things. We'd like to thank the following list of people and organizations for all their help. Literally this, I'm getting booted, but this is my last slide. So yeah, thanks. This reflects the work of so many people from across the Flyway, and I guess I'll stick around for questions later.